I'm going to get started. So today I am joining from Toronto, also known as Toronto, land that belongs to many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Wendat First Nations, and so many others. And while we gather tonight to discuss narrative in poetry, writing, and medicine, it is really critical that we also are reflecting on settlers like myself, historic and ongoing destruction of Indigenous life, heritage, and storytelling practices. Um, and I just want to highlight Tapwaywen Media as an Indigenous-led storytelling lodge resisting this ongoing destruction through their work. They are an independent, Indigenous-run newsroom committed to decolonializing journalism and centering Indigenous worldviews in how stories are reported, framed, and shared through culturally informed and trauma-aware storytelling and media production. And I'm going to drop a link in the chat to where you can donate to this really amazing nonprofit. So, and also their website is linked in this as well. You can find it through it. So if you want to look more into their work, I really encourage that. And now, once again, welcome to Cross-Pollinations, a curatorial research platform that explores relationships between poetry and healthcare, funded by the League of Canadian Poets, the Health Arts Research Centre, and the Canadian Association for Health Humanities. I'm Mick Jones. I'm a poet and I curate this series, and I'm so excited for tonight to be joined by so many of our past guests, past coordinators and curators, and just a truly inspiring panel of poets and healthcare workers for a discussion on narrative medicine. So this panel tonight features the incredible Jacqueline Way, Miriam Golashani, Rhiannon Ng Cheng Hin, Rana Bloom, and Zamina Aziz. We will open with two short readings, then move into our panel discussion and close with an audience Q&A period. So please get those questions dropping in the chat and I will be recording them to ask our panelists. Before we get into introducing everyone on the panel, I'm just going to invite Rana and then Rhiannon to start us off with a quick reading.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for including me. I was sure I knew which poem I wanted to read, and then I wasn't, now that I realize that I'm with all doctors. I suddenly... Is there an echo? No? Okay, cool.
Good, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to stick with the original one, and if there's time, I'll read the other one. This poem I wrote for a student of mine who died about 2 years ago, a young man in his early 40s. Things he said the last time we visited. You smell like cloves and eucalyptus. Please spray some of that in my sleeves. I'll have a popsicle, lemon. Do you have more of that foot energy? Is the canister full? Thank you. I love you. I like that sweater. It makes sense that you're here during these Gnostic rituals. I hope to go to Bridgepoint and have a big end of life celebration with all my friends. Do you consider yourself more a therapist or a witch? I've always liked citrus. It's the Earth's magnetic field. You're like the mother I need now. You are the mother I need now. I'd like to try the mango lassi. Thank you.
Oh no, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. What a beautiful way to start the evening. Um, I'm going to pass the virtual mic now to Rhiannon.
All right. Can you hear me? Okay.
We're good. We can hear you.
All right. Thank you so much, Rana, for the poem. I was sifting through some poems trying to decide what to read tonight, but having some trouble finding a poem that would be fitting. So I thought I would just read instead an excerpt from an essay that I really like that was shared with me by a friend at the beginning of my medical studies. And I return to it very often. And it's an essay called "The Death of Strangers" by Alfonso Lingus, and it's an essay about finding meaning and connection in our relationships with other people, friends, patients, strangers, through recognition of our shared mortality. So I'll read parts of it. We cannot touch the eyes of another or the leaves of the trees without touching their fragility. We cannot make contact with the skin of others or the pebbles of the river without sensing their porousness. We cannot lie with another or under the clouds without suffering the impermanence. Our touch understands the transience of the silver filigreed wings of the flies and the opaque leaves of the moribund giant sequoias, of the polyps in the muck of the deep oceans and the celestial constellations burning themselves out as fast as they can. There is a consolation in our hand, moved by tenderness over the transient surfaces of things. It is not a consolation for our mortality, but an accompaniment of things in their transience. This accompaniment is in our hand that touches with tenderness the fallen tree, in our voice that finds the unjustified calm to keen the moans and wails of the beasts that die, in our insomniac eyes that watch the stars flickering in the immensity of cosmic voids. Memory is not only a depository at the service of the understanding that fixes objects and laws beneath the surface patterns that pass. There is also memory of the surfaces, of the shadows, the reflections, the patterns, the masks, the vortices and the rapids in the river of the time of endurance and vulnerability. This memory is the form of consolation, not of one who retains their forms for himself, but of one who accompanies them in their impermanence. One has to remember.
Thank you so much, Rhiannon. I missed the sound of your voice so much. For all those who don't know, Rhiannon used to coordinate this series with me before med school stole her away. So it is such a joy to have her here tonight. Um, Thank you so much, Rana and Rhiannon, for opening our night with that poetry and the essay. I think that really sets the tone for our discussion. And now I'd love to invite all the panelists to the virtual stage. And typically, I introduce our guests before they go into their portion of speaking for the night. But since we have such a wonderful group already all gathered here, and I don't want to just hear myself talking for 5 minutes, I'm gonna pass it off along to each guest to introduce themselves, their practice, and the work they've done with cross-pollinations in the past. And maybe for my panelists, you could just pass the virtual mic to one of your fellow panelists once you're finished introducing yourself. And let's start with Miriam.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Mick, for the opportunity. I was in Mick and Rhiannon's role, I think probably in something around 2021, 2022, 3 era. So it's really special to be back. I'm now a psychiatry resident in Toronto at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. I previously trained in English literature and philosophy for my master's and undergrad. So that's kind of the background I bring, and I am trying very hard to get back into or to protect that part of myself as much as I can through medical training.
Maybe Rhiannon, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really nice to be back at Cross-Pollinations. I was a co-coordinator with Mick for about a year and a bit up until last year. So it's really nice to be back. And I'm now a third-year medical student at McGill, studying in Montreal. But before medical school, I had a background in sociology and science, and also write poetry and essays, and really enjoy being part of that community as well. Yeah, I'll pass it on to Rana.
Thank you, Rhiannon. I'm Rana Bloom. My practice right now is just writing. Mainly, I write poetry. More and more, I've been writing essays, which I find delicious, unexpectedly. My connection with Cross-Pollinations came because from 2012 until 2019, I was the poet in residence at Mount Sinai Health. I created a program there with Alan Peterkin, who you've probably all know or have heard of, who's retired now, but was the visionary who really started the Health, Arts, and Humanities program at U of T. And I worked with him in a pilot program, and then we created the program for the hospital, and it went on much longer than we planned, and it ended around the time of COVID when things all shifted in a different zone. I still do workshops with healthcare professionals when I'm invited. I love to. I sort of most recent, not most recent, but one of the highlights really of my work was recently was going up to Sioux Lookout to do workshops with the doctors up there. And with Cross-Pollinations, I presented once in 2021, and I had to be reminded by Mick when it was and go back and look at it. And so I've just been, kind of on the sideline admiring.
Amazing. Thank you.
Jacqueline.
Thanks, Rana. Jacqueline Hui, I'm from Calgary, and I'm a palliative care physician. And the last time I was involved with cross-pollination was with Eve Joseph, and it was such a touching, inspiring experience. I was thrilled to be invited to come back again. We talked at that session so much about silence as also a narrative, and parallel charting as part of a practice that I have utilized throughout my career, but also as a teacher. A lot of my work right now is with the University of Calgary in teacher development as well. So I'm a learner as much as everyone else, and I'm so happy to learn from all of you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. And Zamina for our finale introduction.
Hi, everybody. I'm Zamina. It's really, really good to be on here. I remember my first time on Cross-Pollinations was in my first year of medical school. I went to medical school at the University of British Columbia. That's also how I met Sarah, who continued to be a mentor to me throughout all 4 years until my fourth year, where with a bunch of other students, we edited a chapbook with the league and called Adventitious Sounds, of sort of the different sounds and sights and things in medicine that we thought were less medical and more poetic. And so it's so wonderful to be back and to be able to join you guys in this space today. I'm here in New York. I'm an internal medicine resident. And so my journey brought me all through coasts and countries. And so I feel like these days I'm doing a lot less poetry, but ironically, I do a lot of work with our ethics team here. And we talked about Dr. Seuss related to one of our ethics consults, and how just because someone reiterates green eggs and ham doesn't mean that message is going to stick anymore. So that's the little bit of poetry I've done this week.
A little bit a week is always a joy. I love that little window into your current week, Zamina. And thank you so much for introducing yourselves, everyone here. So as you can see, we have a really exciting balance of different voices here. And though Sarah could not make today, unfortunately, she did pass over some questions for me to open this discussion with. So I'm going to start off with one of the first, which is just wanting to know more of how you found your understanding of narrative medicine, whether it be in application or in your own understanding and its theory has developed since you last were joining Cross-Pollinations. So I know for some of you that's quite a few years. For Jacqueline, it's less than a year. But any maybe insights that sparked in this time between, and or that your specific session kind of sparked. And maybe I'll just pass it back to Zamina to start.
I actually remember like distinctly when my interest started. It was during my Masters in Bioethics. I came across a book by Rafael Campo, who is an ICU physician, but also poet. And he wrote a collection. He's written multiple books, but one of his books is a collection of poems called Comfort Measures Only. And I find that I loved like the beginning of that book because he paints a picture of a code, a very um, high intensity, situation where someone's being resuscitated. And he talks about how in high situations of crises, sometimes there is this moment of disassociation where you tend to notice the small what feels like irrelevant details in that moment. So he's noticing like how the IV bag, looks more blue. He's noticing like that the flowers on the table have half wilted, what book is on the corner of the window. He's noticing the purse of the mom in the room. He's, noticing like the Crocs of the person at the bedside doing CPR. You notice these very small details and how he found poetry in the juxtaposition of someone's very life-altering, tragic crisis moment where everyone is doing medicine as a team, but in also how it feels sometimes so jarring to be in those moments and spaces over and over and over again that there needs to be a grounding with certain objects and the strangeness and the weirdness of it. And I think I really just appreciated how he synthesized that in his book of poems. And I think that was sort of one of the moments in which I was like, this makes sense. Narrative medicine makes so much sense in how we think about medicine because when you experience it as a patient, there's one narrative. When you practice it as a doctor, there's another narrative. When you're doing both things together, that's a new orchestra in and of itself. And so I think the practitioner and patient are constantly balancing their own scripts of poetry in their head at every given moment and it always comes together for me in different ways. And I find that as a practice for myself now and a practice for like people on my team, I often refer back to his poems, when we're in moments of crisis, when things are happening and there's disconcurrence between how what we want to do and maybe what the system allows us to do, or how we're experiencing the patient suffering and maybe the limitations of what we can actually provide for them. I sometimes go back to these poems and anchor myself in details. And I find that those anchoring of the details that are not the medical details, not the ins and the outs or the Foley or the vitals and all of the numbers we look at, but the other details, I think anchors myself into the patient narrative in a more concrete way. And so I remember that tool was first taught to me by Dr. Campo's work, and it's still stayed with me to today.
That is so fascinating. I love to hear how a poem or a book of poems can become this theory to actually like live your medical interactions through. Is that sparking anyone in our panel to go next?
Maybe I can. Samina, like I heard when you say noticing, and how often do we walk into a room and we notice the way the patient is looking at his partner of 54 years, and we notice these things, but we don't chart that. There's nowhere to chart this. And all the things that you notice, the body language, the nuance of their conversation, what they're saying to you, what they're not saying to you, it's not written. And so that was my journey into like, what do I want to say about my interaction when I walked into the room and what I noticed and what I attended to and what I observed. And I did start to parallel chart and following kind of Rita Sharon's work. And that gave me an outlet. And it also kind of demedicalized what we practice as given in medicine, which is attach a disease to an identifier. The 100-year-old man, with the end stage right heart failure. What if we identified differently? And what if we start when we share rounds? This is a 100-year-old watchmaker from Denmark who lived on his own home until his hospitalization, valued his independence immensely, and now he has end stage heart failure and is grieving his loss of self.
That, yeah, that really resonates, I think, too, and it's such a rhyme you're saying with what Zamina was saying with looking and noticing and being in this room more. Um, I'd love to pass it off to another panelist to talk about how their narrative medicine journey has been going since their last cross-pollinations.
I can jump off of that because for me, over a decade ago, when I was studying English literature, my entry into everything was a very like traditional narrative medicine, Rita Sharon, parallel chart, that kind of approach. I was introduced to it by actually, I think some people in the audience know Shannon Arntfield at Western University and Lorelei Lingard, and did some training actually at Columbia with the program. By the time I got involved with cross-pollinations, I actually forgot. I gave a talk before I was the organizer. And at that point, I was very early in medical school, and it was also COVID times. It's kind of bizarre. But at that point, I'd done my master's, and I was starting to think, challenge kind of those more traditional teachings. And I think there's like a lot of people who've done like really amazing, kind of expansive critical work around that. And now being 6, 7 years into medical training, I think so much more about um, the lack of narrative, how, especially I think in psychiatry, and I think this is where poetry comes in. Like it's not a clear, traditionally told narrative. There's so much power at play as well of like who can tell what narrative. I know I'm talking a bit vaguely, but I find a lot of my patients, when you think like in a very literal way, like people who are experiencing psychosis, like what is that narrative they tell versus then I have to turn it into a certain kind of coherent narrative that's told in a certain way in the chart. I also think a lot now about what narratives are foreclosed. So I think kind of related to what Zamina and Jacqueline are saying of what narratives or what parts of the narrative aren't told, but also what is like not allowed to be told. And I think last night I was in the psychiatric emergency department. It's the busiest one in North America, the one at CAMH. We're seeing an enormous amount of patients. I open up a chart within probably, I not kidding, and within 20 seconds of opening that chart, I'm seeing certain things that my mind is flagged to see. I've kind of created a narrative of probably where this encounter is going and probably what I'm gonna do. And I think now what has become the more important skill for me in terms of narrative medicine is to kind of try to resist the narrative that I want to go down and to create an opportunity. And as um, I think I can think of so many examples. And in my master's, I was introduced to the work of Sarah Ahmed, who's a feminist philosopher and phenomenologist. And something she talks about that I wrote about in my master's thesis before I'd even done medical training was how a critical part of empathy is the possibility for the other to surprise. So to not foreclose who they're going to be, where they're going to go, like they can truly surprise you. And at that time, I remember writing, I hope that even the thousandth person I see with depression, their narrative still surprises me. And I have to admit, I lose that a lot of times. And so now the thinking for me around narrative is how do I get back to that where the narrative, I don't already foreclose where the narrative is going, and how do I allow myself to be surprised by the narrative or the narratives or the lack of narrative, all of it. Because especially in psychiatry, there's a very clear kind of script almost of the narrative we tell of patient with treatment-resistant psychosis, patient who is unhoused, or as we call no fixed address, patient with BPD and CPTSD. Like there is a narrative script for all of them. So that's kind of where my thinking has gone lately. And it's really hard, and I'm guilty very much of having a foreclosed narrative a lot of the times, because of the demands of a system, because of the specific kind of training I've had.
I see you, Rana, shaking your head a lot, and I feel like maybe you want to jump in there.
Sure. No, I'm really touched by that, Mariam, because the line I just wrote down is, "How do I be curious even in the urgency?" Because that's the surprise is right. I'm going to be curious about you. I'll find out something I don't know, but do I have time for curiosity when everything is so quick, which is what I'm getting from your delivery, and it's also reminding me of what I didn't say in my introduction was that before I was the poet in residence, I was a psychotherapist. So I came from a healthcare background with poetry in parallel. So for all of my career as a psychotherapist, I was publishing books of poetry, and it was parallel. And it was when I let go of more and more the role as a psychotherapist that I actually made them into one thing. And it was kind of, ugh, I don't want to date myself, but let me date myself and say it was kind of around the time, or maybe before, Rita Sharon was developing narrative medicine in Columbia. I never actually formally studied it. I just went and did what I saw to do, which was to use poems with people when it seemed relevant, which I realize is a different thing than what she was teaching, what she's teaching about how to listen to stories, how to be humble, and how to hear them, like what you're describing, Mariam. What I ended up doing when I was working in the field more, because I'm really not, was a lot of the work was offering workshops using poetry to residents, to uh, ask. Like the one, I think one of the first poetry workshops I developed with a colleague was a workshop called "Have You Seen the Patient?" So that the phrase could be, you could emphasize any of the words in that question. Have you seen the patient? Have you seen the patient? And it would do something different for the listener. And it was about doing what you're all already doing now. Like it was sort of the beginning of this conversation, how to begin to look at the patient more as a person. Like this is a whole person. Where have they lived? What have they done? And some of Raymond Carver's poems, I think, really speak to that for me in a beautiful way. Um, right now, because I don't work in the field anymore very much, it's kind of all one thing. I just write poems that I can uh, offer, like poems as offerings. There's more I could say about that, I suppose, in terms of what I used to do, but uh, uh, I think of them as um, maybe as interventions sometimes, but I don't write them for that purpose usually, but sometimes I do. So that's where I've been.
Love that idea of intervention or interruption as a poem's opportunity to engage. And I think like what Miriam was saying about resisting being this kind of like interruption to the process that gets trained into dealing with care at such a high volume. And I wonder now, like, what's this is all bringing up for you, Rhiannon?
Yeah, I mean, I really resonate with that feeling of wanting to resist these like heuristics that were taught almost in this kind of the hidden curriculum as med students. And I find that as someone who's very new, like relatively new to medicine, just in my third year, halfway through my year of clinicals, I've been starting to really see how power dynamics play out in clinical settings, how we are taught to use heuristics to construct narratives before even going to see a patient. Sometimes, the physician will ask, what do you think this is going to be? And it's a really helpful, like, it's helpful to hear that idea of empathy framed in that way. The way that you were framing it, Miriam, with like, you just have to remain curious, and that is such a fundamental part of being an empathetic listener, practitioner, and honestly, just like fellow human being on this fundamental level. And so, yeah, that's been a learning experience for sure as a medical student. And I would say being part of Cross-Pollinations and being able to come to this space, especially over like the last year, has been an incredibly grounding experience during that time of learning, and has really helped to remind me that there is a community of people who are thinking about these things, and has also helped me to think about poetry and narrative as a language of ownership as well. Going back a little bit to what like Zamina and Jacqueline, and also Rana, what you were saying about like how you notice the way that people express themselves, they build their narrative of illness and relate it back to their lives. I think being able to notice those things has been something I've been trying to do a little bit more, and being part of a space like Cross-Pollinations, where both medicine and poetry are ways of making meaning of and healing from things that are not in our control, whether that's a chronic illness or working through grief or addressing systemic injustices that affect health. It's been a very, helpful and enlightening community to come back to. Just to answer your question, Nick, about how Cross-Pollinations has affected and helped our understanding of narrative medicine and care.
I love to hear that, and like I think everyone kind of touched on these points of this of like community and being in conversation being such an important learning pad for everyone. And then I kind of want to jump off of what you were saying at the end there, Rhiannon, of finding like hope in that sort of community. I know hope can be a very polarizing word and like political word, and hope is produced by privilege too. But one of Sarah's questions that she really wanted for us to discuss tonight was asking everyone here what it is in your practice, be it writing or medicine, or if you're practicing both, that you continue to find hope to keep going in. If you find that, or if if not hope, another synonym she was saying is motivating force. And how does one circulate that if one can? Rhiannon kind of opened up the thought thinking about this space for poets and healthcare professionals to engage together, and I'm very curious what ideas that sparks for everyone else. Anything coming to mind?
Maybe I'll give it a go. Nick, I actually really loved this question because I don't know if I sit back enough and have this meta question of what is keeping me going every day, because life is busy. And I really reflected on this question, and I walked away thinking about what do I walk out of the room with? And I go back to a Chinese character actually, and it's the Chinese character wisdom. And the Chinese characters are art forms in itself. And the Chinese character for wisdom is Ji, and it has three parts to it. It's very pictorial, and one reflects like someone like with the bow and arrow, and they're aiming for a box. So that's the top part, but that's knowledge. So if you get your bow and arrow in, you hit it, I got it, I understand. But what makes it wisdom is the something else that anchors it, and it's at the bottom of the character. So it's three parts to this character. And that's what wisdom is. And it's not that every patient sits down with me and says, let me tell you how you should live your life. It's not sharing that it is that shared experience. When Rhiannon, you talked about in your essay that fragility, vulnerability, impermanence, you're touching it, you feel it, and they're sharing the ups and downs and loss and grief and suffering and triumphs and redemption in life. And I walk away with a bit of wisdom that they passed on to me. And I value that because it was a privilege to hold it. They trusted me to pass it on to me. And it's a value. So that's how I walk out of the room, and it keeps me going because someone trusted me enough to share that with me. And it makes me a better person, I hope, and a better physician. And I use that and pass it on to the care that I provide as well, and to my colleagues.
That is such a moving reflection, and thank you so much for teaching us a little more on the Chinese character of wisdom. That's something I am going to be keeping with me for as long as possible. Um, any of Jacqueline's thoughts on hope have our other panelists thinking on how this is working in their own practice?
No, I also will take that character with me as both like a very visual, but also very deep and philosophical representation of like the levels of knowledge. And I think that is sort of what hope building is, we sometimes come in to a room with a certain narrative that we wish to impose on our patients and a certain narrative that they wish to impose on us. And we always and that's sort of where power comes, and that, we're having conversations and having dialogues and trying to treat. I had a specific case recently of a patient who had a necrotizing fasciitis of his leg, and the conversations with him on urgent surgery were really particularly difficult conversations because his idea of losing his leg was not tied to the limb itself, but was tied to what that limb meant to him socially and spiritually and culturally, and the fact that he was hoping to walk to another country to try and get to try and see his family again, and couldn't do that without a leg, and what that leg meant from culturally in terms of his ability to work and be a provider in his own social setting. And I reflect on that conversation as a level of hope because these are the things he hoped for. And the things that we hoped for in that moment was his life and just making sure, he was going to be okay. And the discordance of hope is sometimes what we face as medical providers. And it's sometimes why we walk in with a certain narrative and someone else might have another narrative. And I've been trying to think about how we each then create a new story together as we try and understand each other better. And that itself is an art, and that itself takes time. And I think often medical providers fall into the fallacy of wanting a particular outcome in a conversation. And I've learned that over time, it really doesn't matter what somebody's code status or what someone's outcome is, but the fact that you have that relationship and you build it with them together and you figure it out together. And sometimes I think that ends up being the most powerful story. And it goes back to what both Mariam and Jacqueline both said, in that when we're in that bearing witness to each other and just to be witnesses to each other is sometimes the most powerful thing we can do.
The discordance of hope as an art, that is a lot, and that is a lot. There's a lot in there.
I
Wow.
think I just want to add to what Zamina and Jacqueline said. I think um, for me, it's about connection, and whether I'm writing a poem and it's connection to myself, or I've written a poem and it's offering it to someone else. There's a kind of circularity, and something has been heard, whether I've heard myself or I've heard the world, and or have heard someone else and I've written something in response to that, and then give it back, and then there's some energy that comes from that. Something has been made, something it has been made into a thing that I can actually see if I don't share it with anyone, or offer back if I do, and there's a connection there between many things, people, parts, experiences. That's energizing. That's hope. If you use the word hope, it's aliveness.
I love how everyone's answers are kind of tying back into these like relational elements that feel so at core to what's been shared so far. Um, Rhiannon or Miriam, do you want to add anything?
Uh, um, yeah, this is a really tough topic at my stage of training, and I think in my specialty in particular. I didn't think about prior to going into psychiatry to what extent it is one of the specialties with the highest rates of morbidity and mortality, especially in young people. Like most specialties don't see people in their early 20s who are so, so sick every single day. And that has been really hard. And then pretty much all of my patients, because of the system we're in, where like to access a psychiatrist, you've got to be quite unwell to get to that point. Um, the and usually that is wrapped up in like being unhoused, having very serious trauma histories, like substance, like a lot of things. So all that is to say, that is one of the biggest things I struggle with in residency is how to maintain hope. So it is really helpful to hear from other people that they are able to find space for that. I think, Rana, what you're saying is where I've been trying to direct my energy as a place to foster hope, because sometimes it feels I can start to feel hopeless in my clinical practice. But I try to remember that there's something I can contribute, and I'm, painfully slowly on the side of medical training trying to write a book, like creative nonfiction that I'm hoping is like something I can put out in the world that can like maybe give something tangible in the world in the way Rana was explaining it. And I do also find a lot of hope in my colleagues. Like, I just think I work with amazing residents. I think there's so many really, really amazing residents who, we're all struggling with the same challenges of feeling hopeless at times, but finding a way to like push through and do our best and share advice with each other of how to help our patients. So that's another place I'm trying to find hope. And also, I think, as time goes on, having longer relationships with patients who do reflect back to me. Not that it's their job to say thank you to me or to say something positive to me. Like that's not their job, but when those things do happen, I remember, oh, like yeah, you still have schizophrenia and psychosis that keeps coming back, but you still think that there was value in something I offered you, even if um as Zamina was saying, the outcome, like we're so oriented towards certain outcomes. And so remembering that there are moments of hope, even if the outcome isn't exactly what you thought it should be, like the person isn't cured per se. So that's where I'm trying to find hope, not to drag the conversation down, but it's quite hard these days.
Your presence is more than you know, actually, even in the room. I think I just want to say that because when I was a therapist, there would be times, and I wasn't in as serious situations as you are in, where I would wonder what I was offering. And I once asked someone, why are you coming? She'd come every week, right? Why are you coming? I couldn't believe I just said it at him. And she said, you listen to me. And it was so surprising to me because it was so obvious. I took it so much for granted that of course I did. It was sort of so, it was nothing because it was obvious, but this was enormous for her. So what you take for granted, you don't even realize necessarily, you don't know yet what it's doing.
Thanks for sharing that.
You're welcome.
I'm just going to echo what Rana was saying, Miriam. Like, I've been practicing palliative care for 20 something years now, and I remember um, feeling like this is especially when you see very devastating diseases and young patients as well. But I know your lived experience as a resident in psychiatry is very different as well. But I kind of I also want to remind you, you leave a footprint in the room because you were in the room, and it's still there. So just showing up, just attending, just noticing, you make a difference.
I love to hear like this conversation and Miriam's like honesty about how difficult that question and subject is. I I think these ideas of being detached from the outcome are something really to hold onto and I continue reflecting on. And I'm curious, Rhiannon, if anything has come up for you while everyone's been talking.
Yeah, I think I really resonate with that, especially again as a student who doesn't have that much clinical power in the space at this time. I constantly am wondering, like, is my presence really helping this patient? But I had, yeah, the idea of leaving your footprint in the room it's a very helpful thing to think about because, yeah, I had a patient who I had seen. I was on my OBGYN rotation, if I can just share this little anecdote. And I was on the ER and I went down to see a patient who was in her early 30s, and I took her history, and it was like my second week of clerkship in general, and I was so lost. But I went down and I took her history. I learned about what was going on. It turned out she had an ectopic pregnancy after having gone through multiple rounds of fertility treatment, and she was going to need surgery, and she was going to need her fallopian tube removed. And she shared about her fertility journey, and her partner was there in the room with her. And it was one of those moments where I was really actively trying to separate the medical student, trying to like get all the information that I needed and the checklist with like being present and being with her and understanding her story and what had led her to this moment, like this cross section of her life that we were seeing in the room. And then that later that day, I was in the OR and I was just standing up like at the wall, trying to not get in the way and trying to, but was there at the surgery. And the next day, I felt like, they were asking me questions. I wasn't able to answer them. I felt like even like that day in the OR didn't go too well for me on a personal level. But then the next morning, I went up to see the patient just to see how she was doing. And her and her partner like thanked me for being there and thanked me for coming to see her in the hallway before she went into the OR. Even just to see how she was doing, how she was feeling, and also thanking me for listening to them when we were there in that very overstimulating, unfamiliar environment, which is the emergency room. And that really took me by surprise because I felt like I had been just trying to keep up and trying to not get in the way and not do anything wrong. But it was one of those moments, and I'm glad that it happened at the very beginning of my clinicals because, they were very grateful and really made me feel like just being there and witnessing is even if you're not doing much other than that, than just being a witness, is part of caring for people. And I think that was a good lesson to learn at the beginning, and still relearning that lesson every day. But yeah.
Thanks for sharing that experience, that story. That like is such a window into like the real the trials of the residency and being there with yourself and maintaining that hope in the things you notice and don't notice. And I love to hear these resonances of noticing and witnessing come up again and again as we discuss. And we are nearing our end, but I do want to try to squeeze in one more question. And this question takes place in a magical world in which you could instantly make uh, all healthcare professionals immediately understand one thing about narrative medicine or poetry and its relation to medicine. And if that could be possible, what would it be that you would be trying to communicate?
Maybe I could jump in. I'm still like learning about narrative medicine every day and learning how to incorporate it and the theory behind it. But something that I think is maybe a misconception about narrative medicine is that you need to be a writer to be able to practice narrative medicine or to be interested in narrative medicine. At least that was something that I had thought about and maybe a misconception I had had. I don't think you necessarily need to be a writer to understand or practice the way storytelling works and how people build narratives and follow narratives in their heads. I think it's more so about understanding the way that we each conceptualize illness in our own language and how that allows us to take ownership over that story and understand that narrative, even if it's subconsciously. Yeah.
I love that insight, Rhiannon.
I just think there's some beautiful words that have been like relayed in this conversation that I think we can take, and I think people interpret those words differently. Noticing, silence, witnessing, um, have been, and discordance have been some of the ones, as well as removal. Removing, what is not happening, what is removing ourselves from certain narratives, removing our assumptions and biases from other narratives. And so sometimes I think if I were to answer the question would be in one of those words, whichever one is most grounding to that person in the moment. But even if there isn't like a sentiment in the moment, sometimes asking yourself like what's not happening or what's not being said is also a really important way to, ground yourself to some key questions.
Love that answer in the negative. Um, I think that opens up so much.
I
Amelia, would you?
really,
Oh,
I really,
yeah, go.
yeah, sorry. I just really appreciated this group, this this group of panelists sharing and being vulnerable, because I think that is what I would like to share with my colleagues and other health professionals, that in our vulnerability, we are reflecting and we're able to connect our heart and minds and process what we're seeing and feeling. And sometimes we just use our heads, and sometimes we're just using our hearts, but it is actually making some alignment and connecting, and it gives space for us to process what we're witnessing and noticing. So I'm really thankful that you guys, yeah, were able to share and be vulnerable in this space.
I think for me, it would be to recognize that we are also creating a story. Like it doesn't matter whether kind of what Rhiannon was saying, like it's not just writers or filmmakers or people who create stories and are living in stories. We're writing a story in the way we talk about our patients and the way we notice them, as Zamina was saying, in the way we then like reflect what we notice in the kind of notes we write. And I think to just at baseline recognize that that's a story and that's not actually just objective capital T truth would be a good starting point, I think, for starting to recognize that there's actually space for like the stories that we don't notice or the stories that we don't tell or foreclose.
Rana, do you have any thoughts you want to add?
You know, I don't know if I've said this clearly. I never really studied under the heading of narrative medicine, so I don't really feel confident to offer something around what would be a one thing I would want the doctor to know about narrative
Maybe
medicine.
poetry then is a
Poetry.
better,
I
yeah.
mean, you know, um, I would say get yourself a poet in here. If you can, because they're going to support you and they're going to support your colleagues and they're going to support your patients. And it will be, even if you pay them well, it will be a whole lot less than what you're paying somebody else. So if you can do that, if you can create a program, do that, I would say. And if you can't, be as curious and humble as you possibly can be in asking questions.
That's a great note. Rhiannon, I want to pass it off to you before we close too.
I truly don't have too much to add. I think what Mariam was saying about how narrative is inevitable is a really important lesson that I will continue to think about, because regardless of what we do, we are creating narratives. There are already narratives being rewritten over each other, and we have to be really conscious of which ones we choose to privilege and which ones we choose to ignore or hide, especially in a setting that's already so wrought with power imbalances and systemic and structural frameworks that already serve to privilege some narratives over others. And so I think we can't sit back. We have to be really conscious of which narratives we're contributing to and which ones we are, which ones we are choosing to highlight as well.
I really want this reality in which all these messages are communicated through all the minds really fast, because that was a lot to take away with. And I just really want to echo what Zamina said about staying with these words of noticing silence, witnessing discordance, removal, and also I want to add, yeah, resistance. What Miriam was saying earlier about resistance and kind of the collective voice of everyone speaking to narrative, um, kind of constant moment in all these different rooms. Um, really, really thought-provoking and moving and caring responses and engagement from all the panelists tonight. So I just want to give a big round of applause to all of you, and I wish Zoom had the function to play that loud for you each on your computer, because your presence here tonight is so appreciated, and the chat has been going off with lots of compliments for you all. And I know I myself have like learned a lot from this conversation, and I'm so grateful that it's recorded so we
Can I say
can
one more
share
thing?
it.
I'm just
Yeah.
so glad that you are all the doctors of the future or the present. Really, they're not the doctors I grew up with, and I'm moved by you. Find your people who support you because we want you.
I couldn't agree more. And yeah, I just want to learn from all of you more, and I feel so grateful for the times I've been able to be in conversations with you each, even if it was just tonight. And all the wisdom you've shared. And I'm going to be thinking about that Chinese character, Jacqueline. Um, well, thank you everyone in the audience as well for joining for tonight's panel. This was Cross-Pollinations. The series will be coming to a close in after a few more sessions. So keep a lookout for the next two iterations. And we just really want to once again give a big round of applause to our panelists here tonight. Each of them are doing such important work, such thoughtful work, and we're really lucky to witness this. So we'll see you next time, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday night, everyone. Thank you so much.